So I've saved what I'm working on. I've incremented the file name, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw my squash and stretch into the equation. Now, as we learned from previous presentations, all I got to do is drag and drop the squash and stretch to make it a child of the ball. With the squash and stretch selected, I can zero out the position coordinates and hit apply. And you can see down here in the position coordinates, there is kind of a reference to it says object and it's relative. Alternatively, we could set it to a world coordinate system, and if we set it to a world coordinate system, it would adopt not the parent object, but whatever 0, 0, 0 is, that origin space. So by default, that's how this whole thing is working. All I had to do was zero out the values once that becomes a child of the ball, and at this point, I can start to play around with the squash and stretch. And so I'm going to play around with the factor values. I'll play around with the center and maybe a few other things as well. But so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scrub the playhead back from the previous animation that we had, or the previous demonstration. I do remember that I need to preserve the factor from the beginning, and so I'm just going to take the factor and I'm going to mark that first keyframe by clicking on the bullet. I'll advance the playhead in time. I made a mental note to myself that it was every 20 frames were the keyframes, the bounce keyframes, or the impact keyframes. And so what I'll do is, if I need to, I can go back and reference and look at, this is really where the timeline comes in handy, or the animation view comes in handy. And I'll forget about the position animation, but I can see that there are keyframes on frame 20. That's what these icons here, that's what they represent. And so that is when the change of position is happening. It impacts with the ground and starts working its way back up that animation curve. And so this is the point at which I want to squash this thing. Okay, so with that squash selected, I'm going to go to factor and I'm going to reduce that, and let's say to about, I don't know, 60, 65%, something like that. I'll let you figure it out and be the judge of whatever that should be, and I'll control click on that value. So I remember from my previous presentation too that the glitch that I created when I did that is that my sphere starts to compress before it even impacts with the ground, which is kind of a strange thing. So what I'll do is I'll back that off by 1 frame, maybe 2 frames. I'm going to change the factor back to roughly 100%, and I'll control click on that bullet. And now, as I'm doing this, I'm just going to move forward and really kind of test, scrub through and test that animation. On the other side of the bounce, I'm going to stretch the factor back out, so I'll actually exaggerate and go beyond, maybe something like 120%, I'll say 120%, and I'll mark that keyframe. And as that ball goes back up to the top of the arc, there is no keyframe at 30 for the bouncing ball, but I'll borrow that as a point to reset this factor roughly back down to 100%. And as I mentioned before, there's kind of an art and a science, and you get into a rhythm of this animation. And I'm going to add more details to this animation as I go. But again, there will be a rhythm. So I'm going to take the factor at this point. And if I'm thinking ahead, I know that once I squish this down, if I set this to 65%, I'm going to run into the exact same glitch that I ran into before, which is that I need a keyframe before and a keyframe after. Okay. Now, there's a couple of other tricks that I can use. Right now, my goal is to set these same keyframes here. If I look at these 3 keyframes, this cluster of keyframes for squash and stretch, this keyframe sets the factor of the squash to 100%. This one sets it to a squash of 65, and this one sets it to a factor of 100% or 120%. And as I roll the mouse over, it's even giving me a little bit of feedback of those keyframes. One of the things that I can do is these 3 keyframes, I basically want the same scenario over here on frame 40, the same setup for my squash and stretch. And what I could do is I could manually go over here and say, okay, well, I know what the routine is, and I need I need a keyframe here for factor. I need to preserve that, and so I can just mark that keyframe, advance the playhead, squish it, and then stretch it again on the other side. Let me undo that. The other thing that I could do is I could select this keyframe, I'll shift click, and select all three of these keyframes, the cluster of the keyframes. And Cinema 4D, in many panels or many managers, allows you to hold down the control key and click and drag. I could do this on a lot of different levels, and in the timeline, if I click and drag holding down the control key, it actually duplicates whatever I have selected. Same thing here in the object manager. If I want to duplicate a light, I could hold down the control key, click, drag, and drop, and actually get a duplicate of it. Same thing in the timeline. Depending on what we click and drag and drop, we get a duplicate of that information. And now when I scrub the playhead, I've just saved myself a lot of work, because my ball is bouncing and squashing and stretching. It's coming up over the arc, it's coming back down, squashing and stretching, and I'll use that same technique over here when it impacts the ground again. So I'll hold down the control key, click and drag, and line up that center keyframe, and now my ball's bouncing. Okay, it's looking pretty good. I still want to modify a few things. I think I have that same glitch that I had before, which is that when the sphere is impacting the ground, because I applied the stretch to it, it lifted up the bottom of this thing. And so what I'll do is, let me go back to the standard view. I'm going to split my viewport, go back to the perspective view. I'll get in a little tighter, and I'll render, and I'll see what it looks like down here. So it looks like, it appears that with the lighting that the ball is just kind of floating. But because the y value, the y coordinate is exactly the same, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back through and I'm going to lift my floor up to match the bottom rather than moving all of those keyframes of the ball down. So I can do that really quickly, and I'll be pretty precise about it. So I'll look at this through the front viewport. I'll select my seamless. I'll find that y-axis and I'll just move it up. And I'm just looking to see when that bottom line starts to touch or gets pretty close to the bottom of the ball. The other thing while I'm looking at this is I did like the look of having the center of the squash and stretch redistributed, so it flattens out the bottom. So I'm just going to pull the center back. Now, I didn't do this with a keyframe, and so the result is that the center is always down at the bottom, so that's not something that's being animated. And I might be able to live with that for the entire animation, and I think I can. So that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So there's my bouncing ball. I'm going to add a few more details to this as I push forward, and I'll just kind of do a polished presentation here after this one, and then we'll talk a little bit about rendering and outputting this thing. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.